I try and avoid using the term technology because it rots the brain. I mean, if we talk about cars or aeroplanes or knives and forks or spades, we have sensible grown-up things to say. As soon as we use the word technology, our brains turn to mush, and we start thinking in very Manichaean terms, for example. And the reality is that we don't have a decent account of what I like to call the material constitution of our world, the machines, the processes. And we cover this up with this concept of technology. If you ask the question, what are the most produced materials in the world? Most of us wouldn't have a clue, but up there are things like water and sand and gravel and pig iron and steel and chlorine and ethylene, salt. Now, we don't see these things, partly because some of them don't come out of factories, partly because they're extremely cheap. So they don't register very heavily in economic.
So, David, you are professor of history at King's, and I think I'm right in saying you founded the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine at Imperial College London. In the foreword to Jean-Baptiste Fresso's new book, More and More and More, he describes that book as coming out of like the intellectual environment at Imperial, because I think he was a researcher there as well. So yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. So thank you for joining.
Pleasure.
So the genesis of this, kind of like the idea to talk to you, was the use of history and historical analogy in understanding what might inadequately be called technology. So one thing that I found quite interesting about AI is that there seems to be a geopolitical divide in how AI is kind of considered in historical context. So the US, especially in the West generally, tends to compare AI to the atom bomb or the Manhattan Project, like an existential threat to be contained, whereas Chinese companies and policymakers, if you look at like the AI plus strategy in China, tends to compare AI to electricity, which is like more considered to be a utility to be diffused. Um, and the first question I just wanted to ask was like, do you think analogies are helpful in understanding technologies or technical change? Or do you think historical analogies kind of trap us into particular responses?
Clearly, some analogies will be helpful and others won't be. What's interesting about analogies in this strange area that is discussion of technology, we don't really know what it is that they are often very predictable. So comparing AI with the atomic bomb is just a replica of, comparing a human genome project with the Manhattan Project.
Mm,
Uh, they're desperately unoriginal comparisons. Comparing things with electricity is it's a bit richer, and that's not quite so common. But suggesting that the artificial intelligence will cause an industrial revolution, just like the industrial revolution of the 18th century did, that's a very, very common argument, not a very helpful one. So we need to beware of the analogies. We need to wise up to the small range of analogies that are in play, and to understand why they're being used and what are they being used for.
interesting. Um, That's an interesting point about the predictability of the analogies that are used. I actually have I looked up a kind of list of different analogies that have been used with regard to AI, but I think it's more of a general sort of trend, as you say. But Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, described AI as essentially more profound than electricity or fire. Jan LeCun, until recently head of AI at Meta, he said the invention of the printing press is the closest historical analogy, or sorry, closest historical parallel to AI. Alex Karp, who is the CEO of Palantir, compared AI to the Manhattan Project. So it is interesting because it appears that technologists are very interested in talking about history. And I wonder, because I was thinking about the Keynes, the famous like John Maynard Keynes quote, which says practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual inferences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Do you think that technologists, like how would a technologist go about getting a better kind of historical framing?
Well, you say technologists. Who are these people? They're not necessarily technologists. They are figures associated with great enterprises. I think that's an important distinction to make. Um, Yes, there's a nice little list of comparison. There's always the big ones, isn't it? I mean, they could have said agriculture, couldn't they? They could have said the Neolithic revolution, but that wouldn't sound quite right, I guess. They are looking for big ones. I mean, and that's all they're trying to say is this is going to be big. Yeah.
Mm.
So they search back in, well, probably just Google other big changes in the past, and they could have come up with a wheel. Actually, why is it fire and not the wheel? Why is it the Manhattan Project and not the project to build the B-29 bomber? It doesn't mean anything. It's not the product of research. It's just a PR gambit. It's not to be taken seriously. It's just propaganda. So that's it, really. I mean, I think that's the world written. Now, if one actually wanted to make a historical comparison, well, I guess first of all we wouldn't, because AI hasn't had a major impact yet. We'd have to start with a proper definition of what it is in the present that we want to compare with the past. Actually, if we another way of looking at it is say, well, AI is at the moment is very largely hype. So let's look back at other cases of hype in the past. And actually, nuclear would be a very good example. The nuclear would, in fact, transform the world, was the claim that electricity produced by nuclear reactors would be too cheap to meter. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, the Manhattan Project, as a comparator, is a very strange one, because if you take the Manhattan Project uh, uh, seriously, as opposed to just a kind of reference to big bangs and lots of money, we find actually that atomic bombs have not been used in war since 1945, and that the generation of electricity through atomic power has not, in fact, been that significant. We could easily have lived without nuclear power uh, in the world. What is the story that's been told? Yeah. So these are this is not it's these aren't proper histories, but other kinds of hype. Well, airplanes would bring world peace. Dynamite would lead to the end of war. There are lots of these things. This is a very, very old way of thinking about this mysterious thing, tech. You'd have thought that we'd get over it, but in some ways, actually, AI itself makes it worse, because if you were to ask AI, as the Tony Blair Institute did, what is the future of AI, it will just trawl through all the rubbish that's online and tell you that it's going to be like the atomic bomb, or it's going to be like fire, or it's going to be like the Industrial Revolution. So we are living in a kind of miasma of very bad, very cheap knowledge about these things. So my immediate reaction is none of this is to be taken seriously, except as PR, except as lobbying. There's no analytical intelligence behind any of these claims. There's a political intelligence behind them.
That's an interesting point about the using AI to kind of regurgitate analogies, uh, historical analogies. I think I'm right in saying that Adam Tooze described AI as kind of like a technology of technology, which I thought was an interesting point. But I think I'm right in saying that in your book, The Shock of the Old, if like I reread it in advance of this, I think I remember you describing historians as true experts of the future. And please correct me if I'm wrong with that. In my experience, like studying history as an undergraduate, I think I kind of learned two things. Well, I mean, two kind of headline principles that I kind of took away were the like contingent nature of sort of society, the fact that the past was kind of like continually surprising. And so I tend to consider the future as being likely to be surprising. And then also kind of like humility, the fact that people got lots of things wrong. But I guess do you still believe that historians are the true experts of the future, and why?
Yes, I do, and you've already explained it. We're the experts on the future because we have to train ourselves to remember the future isn't here yet, and we don't know what it is. And we have to train ourselves because, of course, we're looking at the past, and we know what's going to happen next. So we always got to beware, the idea that, say, war was inevitable in 1939, or that India would get its independence in 1947. So we are very used to the idea, or should be very used to the idea, that the future is not completely open ended, but, as you say, will very likely be surprising. And anyone who claims that they know what the future is doesn't know anything about or the future for sure, and doesn't know anything about history either.
Well, that's I guess that's what actually I was thinking yesterday when I was thinking about this question. I was sort of thinking, in a way, then it's useful to kind of like not look too deeply into the past. Like if you have a particular sort of like functional reason for kind of like acting, let's say that you want to raise lots of like capital or in venture capital or something like that. Like in a sense that because maybe there's a balance, like if history does teach us to be slightly more like hesitant about our predictions of the future, that might be less useful for someone who's like trying to raise billions of dollars, I suppose. So maybe there's like a slight paradox there where, functionally, like it's not helpful for some people in their minds to kind of like carefully examine the past. Would you say that's a stretch?
No, no, exactly. But nobody is carefully examining the past. As I say, this isn't serious. Well, it's serious in that it's PR, and it's PR to investors, and it's in particular it's PR to governments who have to support these new technologies. I mean, if you are a serious investor, would you look at historical analogies? Well, no, unless you're doing it really, really seriously. You've got to look at the present. You've got to look at the technology. You've got to make guesses as to what is going to happen. I think the one lesson to take from history is that predictions are likely to be wrong. One very important reason, I guess, is that new techniques aren't exactly the same as old techniques. I mean, in what sense is AI like a steam engine or like electricity? I mean, it's you mentioned Adam referring it to AI as a technology of technology, so it's different in that sense. Now, I wouldn't say is necessarily the first technology of technology. You could say actually that the very phrase technology, the very word technology, I should say, means the study of the technical arts. Yeah, it is a way of understanding that allows you to change the techniques that we have. It allows you to have a generalized view of the capabilities of machines, processes, whatever. So that's not new, and the processing of information is not new either. I mean, that's been central to our lives for centuries. Now the capabilities change, of course. The kind of sensors that you have change. Every new technique is by definition different definition new. So you're not going to find an exact parallel in the past.
Yeah, it's a good point. That just reminded me, I was listening to Andrej Karpathy, who's kind of a well-known, well, he used to be head of AI at Tesla, and he was describing kind of the fact that like AI coding feels more like a continuous, like doesn't feel like a massive break with like previous kind of tools to support coding and programming in terms of kind of like the integrated development environment, which already would auto complete like bits of code and stuff like that. So yeah, it is interesting that kind of like
But look,
um,
why are we talking about AI? Yeah, why is that the one new technique that everybody is on about? Is there nothing else changing in the world of technique, the world of engineering, the world of chemistry?
yeah,
Um,
that's
clearly, there are lots of things are changing, but we're just uh, saturated with this PR about AI. And I'm not an expert on AI. Most people talking about it are not experts on AI. We're
mm,
just being deluged with nonsense. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that AI might not be important, is important, all the rest of it. But the talk we have represents, uh, uh, um, I think, a deliberate attempt to stop us thinking seriously about how the world is changing and how it might change. It is utterly self-interested. And one reason we perhaps don't see that is that part of this self-interested discourse talks about the downsides. It could be dangerous. The machines might take over and kill us all the rest of the stuff. Oh, look, a critical voice. Well, it's not a critical voice. It's just a voice telling us that AI is really, really powerful, but by telling us it could do some very damaging things. Now, that's not new. That's true of arguments about dynamite. Dynamite would either bring world peace or it would destroy the world. Airplanes, same. They'll bring us all together, or they'll bomb us all to smithereens. Either way, it's an argument for the power of the aeroplane. And we have a prior question, which is, what exactly is the aeroplane? What exactly might its powers be? And that is the question that we need to
Mm,
ask. Yeah.
that's a really good point. I mean, I would say from rereading some of your books over the past couple of weeks, common theme of your work is what makes our thinking kind of visible or invisible. I'm thinking about in The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, where you talk about the kind of like historical narrative of the welfare state, like by definition needing to be quite dominant in our thinking in order to kind of stimulate, I guess, support for it, whereas other kind of narratives like didn't need to sort of be as obvious. And also in terms of kind of like in The Shock of the Old, where you talk about the hidden counterfactual alternatives to technologies are kind of, I don't know if you say they're made invisible, but they certainly don't seem to be visible when we think about technologies. We think about them compared to like nothing, I guess, or compared to having no alternative, I suppose. And also, you talk about kind of like the term technology itself, kind of like being potentially like confusing us. And it's interesting that yeah, I mean, that's a really like good point about our current conversation about technology is like saturated by AI. I guess, what do you think is the allure of understanding the history of technology as like a sequence of ages marked by a particular technology?
Yes, I try and avoid using the term technology because it rots the brain. I mean, if we talk about cars or aeroplanes or knives and forks or spades, we have sensible grown-up things to say. As soon as we use the word technology, our brains turn to mush, and we start thinking in very Manichaean terms, for example. And the reality is that we don't have a decent account of what I like to call the material constitution of our world, the machines, the processes. And we cover this up with this concept of technology. That we think we understand something called technology. But what if you actually take a look at what people mean by technology in history? They don't actually mean what we use to live or to fight or whatever it might be. What they mean is the early history of some techniques which have been taken to be important for reasons that aren't usually analyzed. So, what you have in effect is a story, the early history of those techniques which have been thoroughly propagandized in the past and in the present, which have been very visible. So, atomic bombs are going to be there because people have been talking about them for 80 years or whatever. They make a big bang. You can see them on the screen. Airplanes, ditto, a very visible form of transportation. Now, what do you not talk about? Well, the great mass of things. You don't talk about ships in the 20th century. Now, ships are much more important in terms of carrying trade than airplanes, but they're boring, they're old, who cares? So you start with as kind of a account of this weird concept technology, which is the early history of things which are deemed important for probably the wrong reason. And then to create a kind of nice little narrative, you start assuming that there, in any particular era, there are one, two, or three key technologies. And then you assume that these emerge in clusters, and you call these clusters industrial revolutions. So we had the first industrial revolution in the UK in the late 18th century, going into the early 19th, the second industrial revolution in Germany and the United States, which is about electricity and chemicals. And then a third one, possibly, this all gets a bit confusing, maybe in the 90s. And in the most common variant, a fourth industrial revolution, which is something we've been living through maybe since 2010. Now, some people have five and some have six. Some have two. AI is a second industrial revolution. It's basically all made up. There's no evidence behind it, any of this. But it's a nice story. And no politician or indeed historian has been booed off the stage for talking about a second, third, or fourth industrial revolution. In fact, you're thought to be kind of rather profound and certainly knowledgeable about the material constitution of the world. You can talk any old rubbish if you start talking about technology and fourth industrial revolution. And I mean, it's all over the internet, isn't it? The fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, because
It's here.
it reminds me of, and obviously I mentioned earlier, kind of John Baptiste Rousseau kind of says at the start of his book that the book kind of came out of the intellectual environment in your department at Imperial, but his book is really quite interesting on this more and more and more, where he describes kind of like our tendency to think about energy as defined by particular technologies, which are kind of like they transition from one to another, and he sort of undermines that argument. Like, to give one example, he argues the so-called like age of coal was also an age where wood was very important because wood was needed to build coal mines, and it was used, you know, wooden sleepers were used on train tracks to enable the transport of coal. But one, I mean, this is maybe a slight leap, but I was wondering because I was reading an article by David Graeber recently about whether animals play, and he was making the argument that we like, given, I guess, the nature of our kind of like society and current political system, we tend to consider like competition over cooperation. And he was arguing that kind of like there's no reason to think that animals like might not play and might not cooperate with each other. And it's kind of like, but our the dominant metaphors in our society lead us to consider animals as being like competing. And I wonder, I mean, this might be a bit of a stretch, but do you think that that has anything to do with our kind of narrative of technological change as like a series of phases?
Well, there is certainly the sense that new obliterates the old, so that is, if you like, a competition. But I don't think that that kind of thinking is the source of these kind of stage models of energy or material development more generally. I mean, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau's point is that it's not we who think like this. We've been trained to think like this. We've been subjected to very particular models of stages of transitions in energy by interested people. And he goes back, for example, to nuclear scientists of the 1940s, 50s, 60s who wanted to say that we would transition to nuclear. Yeah, and they produced diagrams that purported to show the transitions as the share of nuclear went up, and that kind of thinking has become deeply ingrained in professional circles, in academic circles, and it diffuses out from there. It's not a natural condition of the human mind to think in those ways. I mean, if we look out the window, come up with transition or stage models. I mean, here in London, it's very obvious that the past is still with us. That the layout of streets is old. A lot of the buildings are old. We wouldn't immediately conclude that the world is completely renewed every supposed industrial revolution. That would be an absurdity. And yet, even sitting here in London in that material environment, people do go on about energy transitions and industrial revolutions, and that's because that's the mode that has become established for talking about both of those things. But the point is, it's got nothing or very little to do with either present reality or historical reality, and that's what we need to understand. This is just a way of talking. This is just stuff that's in books and on the internet. It's not stuff that's out there in the real world. It's not what actual engineers work on or do. It's a fantastical world, and it's all to do with convincing us to buy these new things, and above all, convincing government. This is why some things are public. This is why the welfare state has to be public, because it's about government money. It's about politics. Most chemical production doesn't have to be public because chemical companies just get on with it. But AI has to be public because we've got to pay for the energy. We've got to pay for the water. We've got to buy the things that are on offer to supposedly, for example, get the National Health Service here in the United Kingdom working properly. This isn't a disinterested analysis. This is a sales operation on a major scale, part and parcel of huge investments that are being made by very powerful people.
Interesting. Do you think that there's some, I mean, do you think to some degree there is a level, like, do you think there's like, do you think there's some legitimate, like, necessary simplification of the history of technology in order to, the reason I say this is sometimes people talk about, you know, when we're teaching students history, we wouldn't necessarily want to teach them like we would teach like a PhD student, for example. So, like, do you think there's some argument that at different sort of like levels of expertise, we can have different levels of kind of like simplification?
No, of course, self-evidently, we need to have that, and we do have that, but that's not the point. The point is what simplification? If you're saying to me that for the grown-ups, we should have proper history, and for the plebs, we should have any old rubbish, I'd say no. And the stuff that we get in these histories actually is not just in history for the plebs, it's in histories for the elite. About this mysterious thing, technology that is rubbish, and that's the question: why is it rubbish? Not why is it simplified or dumbed down? Why is it wrong?
Yeah.
So to be sure, uh, we need is kind of simplified histories of the material. But what they should be, that the simplified history should be, is I think an open question. And some people have some fun with this. You know, what is the most important innovation of the 20th century? And some people will say, I don't know, the washing machine. And it's not an uninteresting case, of course. So I think we can have lots of interesting simplified histories, which would help us to think. What we have is a lot of simplified histories which are stopping us thinking.
Mm. I think that's a really interesting point. Um,
But it's always the
and
defense, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But you know, we've got to have a simple narrative. We've got to have a uh, 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 yes, a story that we understand, and that's why we are talking about industrial revolutions or whatever it might be. It's very, very common defense. I say, well, you're trying to say that my criticisms are kind of intellectual criticisms, you know, just for the elite. No, my criticisms are precisely the kind of stuff that has been fed to people, uh,
mm,
uh, and actually, I would say that there are much more interesting stories to be told than the ones that we're routinely fed with.
I think that's a really good point. One of the reasons I was asking that question is I used to teach history, and I would say that I was victim of trying, like in certain cases, trying to create, simplified narratives in order to try to like make the subject more accessible. But I think that point about starting with the question that's something that's maybe slightly like counterintuitive, I think is also naturally quite engaging for people as well. I can imagine that would be a really good way of teaching the history of technology in the 20th century, to have that as a kind of like starting question. What was the most important technology? And the fact that it could be kind of counterintuitive
Yeah.
would
I mean,
actually
I'd
be,
avoid the use of the word technology if I
yeah,
could.
sure.
What is the most important process? What's the most important machine? What's the most important technique? Exactly. And people are really interested in that because they will start thinking, you know, about alternatives, what we use things for, what sort of task is more important than some other. And crucially, you ask people to reflect on their own historical knowledge. It's not the case that people don't know what machines were used in the past. They do know from all sorts of sources. So you're getting people to think on the basis of their own knowledge, their own experience. Indeed, sometimes.
One thing I was going to ask is, in the shock of the old, you present a much more kind of like chronologically jumbled picture, maybe, than is maybe commonly presented in terms of considering techniques, machines, the material, kind of history of the world. Like, there's lots of different examples I could pick on, but some include, I think I'm right in saying that you note that electric vehicles were more common in the 1900s than petrol cars were, which is quite counterintuitive. Or that the German army in 1941 invaded Russia with more horses than Napoleon did in 1812. And I think I'm right in saying that like small modular reactors are not coming back into fashion, even though they were invented in the 1950s. And a lot of people in the AI world anyway are talking about like small modular reactors as being the future of nuclear energy, which I think is another example of the shock of the old. as I said before as well, kind of like the electricity grid is becoming kind of like incredibly important for lots of emerging technologies, which is not a new technology. I guess, do you think that other domains of study are less like teleological? Are we able to kind of understand regression better in terms of like economics, in terms of other aspects of society?
Well, it's not so teleological. I mean, it's uh, as particular models of replacement of the old by the new. Are we better in other areas? I guess we are in that we are more likely to want to find continuities in history in other areas, maybe in political history, for example. One wouldn't imagine that politics was invented yesterday, or the particular kind of politics we have today was invented yesterday. On the other hand, our accounts of the modern world are profoundly influenced by these stage theories of the material. So even political historians or cultural historians, you might well want to stress continuity when it comes to the material will also tell these stories of radical discontinuity. So these stories have a very particular influence because we do believe, you know, most academics, at least in the West, believe that we live in an industrial age or a post-industrial age, a scientific age, a technological age, an age of mass production, an age of post-Fordism. You know, these are all concepts about the material which are taken to represent profoundly important realities. So I don't think it's particularly useful to say that, you know, other fields know how to deal with this and the field of study of the material doesn't. I mean, some people would say that anthropologists, and Bruno Latour, I guess, would say, you know, anthropologists looking outside the West have a kind of straightforward empirical view of the complexities of the interactions of nature and culture, and we should apply that insight to the West. But I think it's not so easy, precisely because we understand the West in these very particular terms.
Hmm, that's really interesting.
But it's not difficult for, as it were, non academics, yeah, because we just look around and it's no surprise to us that our world is full of machines of different vintages. It's kind of obvious.
Hmm,
Just
that's
not
really good.
obvious once we get into the realm of books and the word.
Hmm.
I mean,
Um,
you only have to look around. I'm sitting in a room here. I've got computers in front of me, obviously, but you know, I've got copper cable. I can see a wooden window. I can see glass. I can see plastic. I can see, well, all sorts of stuff. And most people will have a sense of how all this stuff is.
that's a really interesting point about it's actually like the word. Once we get into the realm of like thinking about words, that can potentially cause us to think differently.
Yeah.
Um,
And we think more intelligently about steel than we do about technology or indeed science.
okay, I feel like this question might be then confusing the matter more, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Um, do you think our society is becoming more techno deterministic?
No, because uh, technology isn't determining. And you've got to ask, you know, what is the techno bit? What is the technology? And what people usually mean by that is innovation. And innovations can't determine anything. Innovation is just a first use of something. Doesn't have to be used again. This whole technological determinism thesis is itself nonsense because it's usually interpreted to mean selected innovations drive history. Some foolish people say that or imply that. But if you were to ask the question, is the primary shaper of our range of possibility the material constitution of our world? Then you might start thinking, well, that's an interesting question. How might I answer that? And you'd have to work out what the material constitution of the world was before you could start making comparisons between that material constitution and possibilities. And we're nowhere near there. We're nowhere near there. We don't have the means to answer that that question. The idea that the world is more technically determined now than before is simply unanswerable.
I'm more meant, does our society like think of technology as becoming more deterministic than in the past? In the sense of the reason I ask that is kind of like when I watch the news and when I hear people talking about new technologies, it feels to me as if they are spoken about in a sense that they are kind of like self-determining kind of natural forces. And I was wondering whether
Yeah.
that's a new phenomenon or
No.
whether in the past people always, or like we've always kind of thought about technology in this kind of deterministic way.
Well, first of all, people aren't thinking about technology in any broad sense, in that deterministic way. They're making claims for very, very particular innovations. It's not technology, it is the particular innovation. And yes, people write as if AI had its own logic and it was imposing itself on the world and that we can't resist it, we just have to adapt and so on and so forth. Very common argument. It's meant to stop us asking, who's behind this? Who's telling me this? Is this new? No, it's as old as the hills. Not as old as the hills. I should correct myself, especially as a historian. It's certainly more than 150 years old.
What do you think the key, I mean, this might be quite a naive question. What do you think the determining factors are?
Well, there's a question. What is driving change in the world? There are actually lots of different answers to that question, aren't there? If you ask experts on that question, what might they say? Well, they might well say, in the final analysis, the forces of production or science and technology or innovation, something like that. But the serious ones, at least, would also want to discuss the concept of capitalism, let's say. Capitalism is the main driving force in the world and might indeed be driving innovation, might indeed be driving the development of the forces of production. And other people might say it's something like industrialism as opposed to capitalism. Well, I suppose there'd be other variants of those sorts of arguments. Some people might say competition. Once you release people's innate capacity to want to do new things by opening up markets, you get change. People who are religious believers might give you different sorts of answers. But again, I often find that people say, well, okay, you're casting doubt on technology as the driving force, so that leaves us with nothing, is the implication. So how do you explain in change? Actually, there are lots of other explanations of change, which we, in fact, routinely use in political discourse, in academic discourse, in daily life. We don't go around saying our lives have got worse or better because the internet came along, unless you're having a conversation about the internet, in which case you would do that. You talk about wages, prices, crime, the weather, and all sorts of things. So again, I come back to this point that we are much, much more capable of having serious discussions about our world than the discourse on technology and science suggests. We can have a much more intelligent conversation about the washing machine than about AI or technology in general.
One quote from Roberto Unger, the philosopher, in his book, I think it was from 2007. It's a book, I think it's called Analogies Society. But he asked the question, who gets to innovate? And I think Evgeny Morozov has sort of also kind of explored this question. Do you think this is a useful kind of question to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. Who gets to innovate? I mean, nowadays we're all supposed to be innovators, aren't we? We're all creative. We apply for jobs. I'm an innovator. I don't teach like anybody else. I don't manage my time like anybody else. I've innovated. In fact, by using that language of innovation, you're just showing that, in fact, we are all very imitative. Yeah, we're expected to say we're innovators today, but the reality is that the capacity to innovate is highly restricted to very particular institutions. Actually, large firms, new firms, which have a lot of money behind them. These are the institutions which are innovating, and we need to understand them if we to understand innovation. States innovate in certain ways as well. Why do they do it? Why do they innovate in this area rather than that area? Yeah, these are absolutely the key questions.
Would you say in the shock of the old, the true heroes of innovation are the users?
No, no, I
No.
wouldn't say that. I think there aren't any heroes in shock of the old, but people have wanted to see my story as a one that says, well, ordinary people are innovators. And I react against that a little bit. Yes, we all change things. We all have some agency. But when it comes to inventing really big things, we don't have much agency. Yeah, in fact, systems are there to make sure that we don't have any agency. So my book is a plea to understand where technical change comes from, and not to talk ourselves into a world in which we believe we uh, we're all kind of contributing to the big changes. We're not. As I say,
Interesting.
we live in this very weird culture where we are expected to say that we are all creative and innovators. Actually, we live in the greatest age of imitation.
But as in, I guess, would you say that it's important that to some degree, in an ideal scenario, the innovation would be to some degree inclusive in the sense that, or democratic to some degree, so that if there was some innovation that was being kind of foisted on people that kind of like materially made their lives worse, they could have some say in that?
Well, sure,
Or
of course, but just believing that we're all innovators and creative isn't going to help us with that. On the contrary, it stops us seeing where the innovations are actually coming from, and what it would take to control them. And what it takes to control them is not having some discussion about research policy, or having people involved in discussions with scientists. No, because the scientists and the universities and so on aren't deciding on these things. It's corporations and investors that decide on these things. If you're saying to me that we should have democratic economic planning, I'd say to you, well, that I may well agree with you, but achieving that would be extremely difficult because it would meet enormous resistance from the very people who are controlling innovation. So we can't kind of just talk our way into controlling technology by believing that we are innovators, or that as users we necessarily have the power to change things. And we do have some power. I think one important thing to remember is that we have to reject most of the new things that we're offered. The we here is not just ordinary people, but also, say, investors, or the management of firms. They will they will have to choose between different research projects, between different good ideas to pursue. We as consumers have to choose which phone we're going to buy. We can't buy every phone, but if we turn down a Samsung, people don't say, "Oh, you're a luddite. You've turned down a Samsung." That would be absurd. But when we talk in general, and I don't quite like this new machine that we've been offered. Oh, you're a Luddite, you're stopping progress. No, I just don't like this particular machine. Come up with a better one. Let's see what I think of that. So, our language is deeply loaded and profoundly unhelpful around this.
interesting. I was just thinking, one, I don't know what the right word would be to describe this as a category, but I sometimes wonder if language is a technique that is quite sort of like democratically sort of shaped in the sense of, yeah, I mean, language, I mean, obviously, I mean, it's hard to kind of generalize about it, but it's, the Northern Irish people, like I'm from Northern Ireland, it's not like we don't speak in exactly the same way as English people or Scottish people, and we have some of our own words, and, we have Irish, which is a separate language. So I wonder whether that is one example where there is some level of sort of like democratic input, or it's an area where the only sort of like source of power that an individual has isn't just like rejection, but also there is some sort of like generative power as well.
No, sure, of course. But when it comes to kind of machinery and things, where does one find this kind of thing at the political level? Say, very hard. It is different, and I hope we will be able to find the sort of language. And I hope that we just have a richer, more open, more democratic understanding of. I come back to this phrase: the material constitution of our world. I mean, if you ask the question, what are the most produced materials in the world? Most of us wouldn't have a clue, but up there are things like water and sand and gravel and pig iron and steel and chlorine and ethylene, salt. Now, we don't see these things, partly because some of them don't come out of factories, partly because they're extremely cheap. So they don't register very heavily in economic statistics. They make up our world. I mean, steel is so cheap that it's everywhere in more massive quantities than ever before. And now, if we want to think about climate change, which is maybe one area where we have a kind of democratic politics about the material constitution of the world, we need to absolutely understand all these things. If we are going to reduce CO2 emissions, we've got to change the nature of our transport vehicles. Yeah, they've got to keep petrol. They've got to stop getting bigger. These um, these cars. If we're going to use steel, we'll probably have to make it kind of more expensively. These are very big issues which are going to require democratic consent. So this isn't just a sort of academic discussion. This is really serious. I mean, how do we change the material constitution of the world, which we need to do? It's, uh, it, good elite understanding of what that is, which is our major first problem, and without popular understanding.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think I've heard climate breakdown being described as one issue where we're all kind of like perpetrators and victims at the same time. Although obviously all of us, some more victim and some more perpetrator. But and the kind of question about, I suppose, NIMBYism and whether people are willing to have like a solar farm in their community, for example, and or offshore wind farms. Like I know some people who kind of have asked me to sign petitions trying to stop wind farms in their area, which yeah, and so that's a really good point about kind of like the democratic aspect of it and thinking about how the benefits of such like, wind farms or solar panels could be kind of put back into those
Yeah, but
communities
I mean,
at one point.
you mentioned Jean-Baptiste Frizol's brilliant book earlier. I mean, the fundamental points that come out of that is you can't just think about climate in terms of wind turbines and electric cars and things. You've got to think about the whole world of production and carbon, and to do, you need to understand where the carbon dioxide comes from. Yeah, and it's not just electricity generation. It's not just cars. It's about making wind turbines uses coal, which produces carbon dioxide. It's a really complicated issue, and any serious politics of decarbonization has got to go very much further than our windmills are a good thing.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And
Um,
very, very much further than AI will help us optimize our emission profile or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think one thing that was interesting about that book that I took away was kind of like that like Presso wasn't saying um the transition or you know a more sustainable future isn't possible. He was just more saying like it's very difficult and we need to be serious
Mm,
about it in order to make it happen.
exactly.
I would say if I look at some of the things that like I would say China appear to be like at the moment the most serious. I don't know if like I don't necessarily know if I know enough about it to be able to say like maybe it's not clear yet as to how serious they are about decarbonizing, but they are obviously like the speed at which they are building renewable energy is kind of is really notable. I had one thing I was also wondering, going back to the point about who gets to work. So I wanted to link your idea, your work in Shock of the Old to the idea of temporal claustrophobia, which Jonathan White takes from the historian Chris Clark. And he Jonathan White talks about like us currently living in or our current political situation being kind of narrated as an emergency, which reduces our ability to think in the medium long term. And I wondered like whether you think that kind of short-termism and our obsession like relates to our obsession with innovation. Like, do you think we're addicted to the new in part because we've lost the ability to kind of like value longer term qualities like repair, maintenance, stability?
I mean, who's the we here? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, but I would say that all this emphasis on the new is nowhere near as convincing as it used to be. And we had this very, very old rhetoric about novelty and change and so on. But we're less inclined to believe it. And we're less inclined to believe it because economies have been stagnating, because living standards haven't been going up. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, in say the UK, being told that the future was going to be better than the present was a plausible argument, given that people's standard of living was rising pretty rapidly. It's not so plausible now. So I don't think we are as gullible, as receptive to claims for innovation as as we might think. I think politics has changed in all sorts of ways, and it certainly can't be reduced to a cult of novelty, or much less a new cult of novelty.
Thank you so much. I think we can wrap up there. Like, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, David. And
Thank you.